There's a number I need you to keep in your head tonight. Not 7. Everyone knows 7. I need you to remember a different number. The number is 4. 4 people. 4 names. 4 futures that existed on the morning of January 25th, 1990. And then... Actually, let me back up. Let me tell you the whole thing from the beginning. Because if I give you the 4 right now, before you understand what the Hume Highway was in those years, before you understand what the Belanglo State Forest is and what it does to sound and distance and time, it won't land the way it needs to. What I can tell you right now is this. On January 25th, 1990, a young British man walked into a police station in a small Australian town and gave the police everything they needed to stop what was happening. Everything. The description, the car, the weapon, the location, the man's name, all of it. And 4 people died anyway. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Not the killer. There have been killers before, and there will be killers again. What I keep coming back to is that morning, that police station, that filing drawer closing, those 4 names. By the end of tonight, you'll know exactly who they were. And you'll understand why that number, 4, sits in the gap between what happened and what should have happened. Stay with me. The section of the Belanglo State Forest, where they found the first 2 bodies, has a name that nobody remembers choosing. Executioner's Drop. Not named after the murders. Not named after anything specific, as far as anyone can trace. It's just what that corner of the forest has always been called. A name that was there before the reason arrived. The kind of name that makes you wonder, years later, whether some places know something about themselves that we don't find out until it's too late. On the morning of September 19th, 1992, 2 men were running an orienteering course through that section of the forest. One of them stepped off the trail to check a reference point in the undergrowth. He found a body. Not bones. A body. Decomposition had been working for months, but what remained was unmistakably human and unmistakably arranged. Face down, arms pulled back behind the torso, covered by a carefully constructed pyramid of sticks and fern branches, the kind of structure that takes minutes to build, the kind you don't build by accident, the kind that requires you to be comfortable with what's underneath you while you're doing it. The man called to his running partner. They stood there together in a forest that had just become something else entirely. The following morning, investigators found a second body 30 meters away. Same position, same careful pyramid of sticks and ferns, same arrangement of the arms. The bodies were identified as Caroline Clark, 21, from Northumberland in England, and Joanne Walters, 22, from Mid Glamorgan in Wales. Both reported missing 5 months earlier. Both last seen on April 18th, 1992, in the King's Cross neighborhood of Sydney. 2 young British women about to hitchhike south together, looking for fruit-picking work in Victoria. They had left together because together seemed safer. The forensic examination of those 2 women is where this story becomes something harder to look at directly. Joanne Walters had been stabbed 15 times, 9 times in the back, 4 in the chest, once in the neck. The angle analysis of the wounds indicated that multiple injuries had been inflicted while she was still alive. The body's bleeding patterns told investigators what sequence the wounds had come in. A specific stab wound to her spine was consistent with deliberate incapacitation. Not a killing blow, a controlling one. Something to keep her present while whatever happened next happened. Her underwear was missing from the scene, not present elsewhere in the burial area. Gone, taken. Police forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton reviewed the totality of what had been done to Joanne Walters and then to Caroline Clark, and was asked to provide a motive assessment in the plainest possible terms. He said one word: pleasure, not anger, not fear, not any motive that begins in something we can recognize as human. Just that. Pleasure. Caroline Clark had a jumper tied around her head before she was shot. 10 times. Investigators mapped the trajectories. The bullets had entered from multiple angles that weren't consistent with a single firing position. The body had been repositioned between shots. She had been used as target practice. Someone had done this in the Belanglo State Forest on a quiet afternoon in 1992, and then carefully rebuilt the pyramid of sticks and ferns above her, and then walked back to their car, and then driven home, and gone back to work the next week. And absolutely nobody knew. Within 14 months of that September morning, 5 more bodies would surface in the same forest. But before any of that, before the investigation, before the task force, before the name Ivan Milat meant anything to anyone, there were 7 young people. 7 ordinary people who had done something ordinary, something that thousands of travelers did every single year in Australia. They hitchhiked. And that's where we start. To understand what the Hume Highway was in the late 1980s, you have to understand what Australia was selling itself as. The backpacker economy was enormous. Young Europeans, British, German, Dutch, Scandinavian, were flooding into the country on working holiday visas. Australia had a specific brand in those years. Friendly, open, safe. She'll be right. No worries. The hitchhiking culture was not fringe behavior. It was part of the texture of traveling there. You stuck out your thumb and a friendly Australian stopped. That was the deal. That was how it worked. There were no mobile phones. Once you got into a car on that highway, you disappeared from the world as completely as if you'd stepped off the edge of it. No GPS, no live location, no last seen notification, no trail of digital footprints. You were simply traveling. And if something went wrong, the first anyone would know was when you stopped writing letters. Deborah Everest had never hitchhiked before. Her mother said that later, after everything. Debs had never hitchhiked before. She'd never been away from home before. She was 19 years old, and she and her boyfriend James Gibson, also 19, also from Melbourne, had checked out of their Sydney hostel on December 30th, 1989, and stuck out their thumbs on the road south. They were heading to a music festival near Albury, 6 hours away, a straight shot down the Hume Highway. They never arrived. The day after Deborah and James left the hostel, a bushwalker found James Gibson's camera at the side of a road called Galston Gorge, in the northern suburbs of Sydney, over 120 kilometers north of where they were supposed to be going. In exactly the wrong direction. The camera was damaged. The bushwalker took it home. He didn't report it to anyone for a month. By then, it didn't matter. By then, they were already in the forest. The families reported them missing. Police noted the report. Hitchhikers change plans. They lose track of time. They extend their trips. They turn up. That was the assumption, comfortable and completely wrong, that settled over their disappearance like a lid. January 20th, 1991. Simone Schmeidel was 21 years old and German, backpacking through Australia on a working holiday visa. She had a specific destination and a specific reason for it. Her mother was flying from Germany to Melbourne to visit her. Simone was hitchhiking down the Hume Highway to be there to meet her. Her mother landed in Melbourne. Simone wasn't at the airport. The letters stopped. Her mother waited, then reported her missing. The assumption, she'd changed her plans. She'd meet up with them later. She would turn up. December 26th, 1991. Boxing Day. Anya Habschied was 20. Gabor Neugebauer was 21. German, a couple traveling together for the same reason most couples travel together: the added sense of safety that two people are supposed to provide. Two people are harder to control. Two people can watch out for each other. Two people surely would be fine. They left the Backpackers Inn at King's Cross, Sydney, planning to hitchhike to Adelaide and then north to Darwin. They were never seen again by anyone who survived the encounter. 7 young people between December 1989 and April 1992. All between 19 and 22 years old. 3 Germans, 2 British, 2 Australians. All reported missing. All assumed, by every authority that received those reports, to simply be somewhere they hadn't communicated from yet. Every single one of them vanished from the same corridor of highway. And the man who took them drove that same corridor for work. Every week, for years. Ivan Milat worked for the New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority. Highway maintenance on the Hume. He knew every section of that road the way you know your own face in a mirror. The cameras, the dead zones, the turnoffs that went nowhere visible from the main road, the specific times of day when certain stretches were completely empty. He wasn't just driving the highway where the backpackers were. He was paid to maintain it. They were standing on his work site. The Belanglo State Forest is a pine plantation, not a natural forest. Planted 3,500 hectares of radiata pines in long geometric rows. The first of them put in the ground in 1919. The rows create something that feels wrong from the moment you step off the tracks. You can see long distances in one direction and then turn 90 degrees and find yourself enclosed. The Odzam canopy blocks daylight. The floor is layered deep in fallen needles that absorb sound so completely that your own footsteps stop making the noise they should. The site at Executioner's Drop sits on a fire trail called the Longacre, off the main road for a few minutes, invisible from the highway, invisible from everywhere. The author Mark Whitaker spent years researching the Milat case and later said this: "I was often sitting at the typewriter, crying. These days, I try not to contemplate what could have gone on there." A man who spent years professionally studying what happened in that forest found it easier, when it was over, to stop thinking about the forest entirely. I think about that a lot. In October 1993, 13 months after the first bodies were found, a man named Bruce Pryor discovered a human skull and a thigh bone in a remote section of the forest. Bruce Pryor was not a detective. He was not part of any official investigation. He was a local who had read about the discovery of Clark and Walters and felt something that he couldn't let go of. The specific conviction that the search had ended too soon. That the official conclusion, the one that said the forest had given up all its secrets, was wrong. He had been going back to Belanglo every single weekend for 9 months. Alone, walking sections that the official search had moved past. Following the particular logic of someone who knows a piece of ground well and has decided to trust that knowledge over the official record. He found the skull. He called police. They came. 2 bodies, discovered quickly in the area around his find. Later identified as Deborah Everest and James Gibson. The 19-year-olds who had left Melbourne for a music festival on December 30th, 1989. They had been in that forest for 3 years and 10 months. James Gibson's skeleton was found in a fetal position. 8 stab wounds. A large knife had been driven through his upper spine, not in a way consistent with a killing blow in a struggle, but in a way consistent with deliberate targeting of the spinal column. he would have been paralyzed from that point. His jeans were unzipped, the top button still fastened. His backpack and camera had been found 120 kilometers north of where his body was. Someone had taken them there, deliberately. Someone had wanted his trail to point in the wrong direction. Deborah Everest. Her skull had been fractured in 2 places. Her jaw was broken. There were knife marks on her forehead. Shallow incisions that didn't connect to any vital structure, that served no functional purpose in any definition of the word. They were put there because someone wanted them there, because someone had time to put them there. She had been 19 years old. She had never hitchhiked before. 1 month after Gibson and Everest were found, police located 3 more sets of remains. Simone Schmidl, stabbed 8 times. 2 of the wounds had severed her spinal cord. Others perforated her heart and lungs. Unlike the other victims, she had not been covered. No sticks, no ferns, no pyramid. She had been left on the ground, uncovered, face down in the pine needles. The absence of the ritual that had been present for every other victim is one of the details that forensic profilers circled. It suggested that what happened to Simone Schmidl had, in some way, moved past the need for ceremony. That the ceremony had become secondary to something else. 2 days later, Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer. Gabor had been bound, gagged, shot 6 times. 3 of the shots had been placed at the base of his skull, execution positioning, the kind that requires the person being shot to be still. Controlled, positioned. The ballistics matched weapons connected to other Belanglo murders. Anja Habschied was 20 years old. There was a cord, a sash cord, later possibly traced to the Milat family home, tied around her neck in a way consistent with a leash. She had been stabbed 8 times. Her spinal cord had been cut. Her head was not with her body. In 30-plus years since that discovery, through the trial, through 7 life sentences, through the death of Ivan Milat in October 2019, Anja Habschied's head has never been recovered. Her family has never had it back. The forest kept it. Dr. Rod Milton's criminal profile, completed before any suspect had been formally identified, contained 3 conclusions. All 3 proved accurate. The killer operated from pure pleasure, no transactional motive of any kind. The killer had specific, intimate knowledge of the Belanglo State Forest in particular. And then the third, he did not believe a single person had done this alone. Most victims had been taken in pairs. Controlling 2 young, healthy, terrified people simultaneously requires either overwhelming physical dominance or a second person. Someone who was there. Someone who stood in that forest and participated and has never been charged with anything. Ivan Milat's own sworn statement, in a different context, referenced multiple people. The number he gave was up to 7. The accomplice, or accomplices, were never officially identified. Ivan Robert Marko Milat. Born December 27th, 1944. 5th of 14 children. His father was a Croatian immigrant. The family was large and rural and kept very much to itself, settled in bushland in the southern highlands of New South Wales. Less than an hour from Belanglo. His brother Boris, speaking after the conviction, said something that the coverage of this case tends to quote and then move past too quickly. He said that Ivan had seemed normal until he was around 12 or 13. And then the stories started coming back from Ivan's friends, things they'd done together at night. With machetes, in the bush, his exact words. He was going to kill somebody from the age of 10. Ivan accumulated a criminal record through his teens and 20s. Theft, burglaries, the standard catalog of someone who treats other people's property as available to him. He was physically powerful, meticulous about his appearance, capable of charm. He developed an obsession with firearms and bladed weapons that went beyond what the people around him could comfortably explain as hunting enthusiasm. In 1971, 2 female hitchhikers filed a formal complaint against him. They said he had picked them up, driven them off the highway, and assaulted them at knife point. He was charged. He was tried. He was acquitted. Evidentiary problems. The prosecution couldn't hold it together. The lawyer who won that acquittal was named John Marsden. Ivan Milat walked out of that courtroom at 26 years old, having learned a specific, durable lesson. That he could do this. That he had done it. And that the legal system would fail to hold him. He was right for another 23 years. By 1989, he was 44 years old, powerfully built, with a dark mustache, working roads and living quietly in the suburbs of southwestern Sydney. Nobody who met him in a normal context described anything that rang as wrong. He was cagey about his work when he talked to strangers, which in retrospect has a specific reason, but which at the time read as mild privacy. He was the kind of man you sat next to on a long drive and forgot by the time you arrived. When he picked up hitchhikers, he introduced himself as Bill, his brother William's name. It wasn't random. Milat had used his brother Bill's identity for years, on job applications, vehicle registrations, in situations where he needed to be present but not traceable. If anything ever came back, it came back to Bill, not Ivan. The conversations at the start of each drive were unremarkable. Friendly. He asked where you were going. He asked who knew you were on this road. He asked when someone would next be expecting to hear from you. Questions that felt like friendliness. That were, in fact, him calculating your exposure. How long it would take anyone to notice you were gone, and how long that gave him. The forest was never more than a few minutes away. He always knew exactly where he was going to turn. January 25th, 1990. Paul Onions was 24. British. Hitchhiking from Liverpool Station south of Sydney toward Mildura. Trying to get to Victoria for work, the same reason half the backpackers on that highway were heading south. A silver Nissan Patrol slowed to a stop. The driver had a dark mustache and a friendly manner and said his name was Bill. For the first part of the drive, it was unremarkable. Paul talked about his plans. Bill drove and asked questions, slightly too specific, slightly too interested in the logistics of Paul's situation, but not obviously wrong, not enough to name at the time. And then, south of Mittagong, less than 1 kilometer from the entrance to the Belanglo State Forest, Bill pulled the car over. He said he was looking for some music cassettes under the seat. Paul, mildly uneasy by this point, got out of the car to stretch his legs. Bill straightened up. He was holding a revolver and a length of rope. He said, "This is a robbery. Get back in the car. Put your seatbelt on." Paul Onions did not put his seatbelt on. He ran. He threw himself out of the car and onto the shoulder of the Hume Highway, and he ran at 100-kilometer-an-hour traffic with his arms in the air. And he ran because the part of his brain that controls survival had made a decision that his conscious mind was still catching up to. He could hear footsteps behind him on the gravel. He could hear a voice. Then he heard the shots. Gunshots, on a public highway, on a Tuesday afternoon, within sight of any driver passing at speed. Ivan Milat was shooting at a running man in daylight, and he was not adjusting his behavior for witnesses. He had been doing this years. He had been in a courtroom and walked away, He had taken people into a forest, and they had never come back. He was 1 kilometer from that forest right now with a man in his sights. He was not afraid of being seen. A woman named Joanne Barry was driving south on the Hume Highway. She saw a young man running in the road with his arms up, clearly in genuine terror, the kind that shows in the body in ways you can't perform. She stopped. Paul Onions threw himself into her van. She drove him to the nearest police station, in Bowral. Paul Onions walked in and gave them everything. The description, the silver Nissan Patrol, the registration number, the rope and the revolver, the exact location where the car had pulled over, less than 1 kilometer from Belanglo State Forest. A constable took his statement, handed him 10 Australian dollars. The report went into the filing system. Not actioned, not circulated, not followed up. Gone. Here are the 4 names. Asked you to remember at the beginning. Simone Schmidl, who left Sydney to meet her mother in Melbourne. January 1991. Anya Habshid, who left King's Cross with her boyfriend on Boxing Day. December 1991. Gabor Neugebauer, who left with Anya. December 1991. Caroline Clark, who left with Joanne Walters looking for fruit-picking work. April 1992. Those are the 4. Paul Onions walked into Bowral Police Station on January 25, 1990, and those 4 people were alive. The car was described. The man was described. The road was named. The location was 1 kilometer from the forest. All 4 of them died after that filing drawer closed. After Clark and Walters were found in September 1992, the investigation became one of the biggest forensic operations in Australian history. Hundreds of police. Satellite imagery used to analyze road and track conditions around the time of the murders. Computer cross-referencing of vehicle records, firearms registrations, work histories. And then they declared the forest was done. No more remains. 13 months later, Bruce Pryor proved them wrong. When Gibson and Everest surfaced in October 1993, the case broke open publicly. A detective superintendent named Clive Small took command of a dedicated task force, Task Force Air, and the phone lines opened to thousands of calls from the public. 230 initial suspects, methodically narrowed to 32, and then to 1. Police confirmed Ivan Milat had not been at work on any of the days the victims had disappeared. Not one. Every single disappearance aligned with a day he was absent from his job on the highway he maintained. They also learned he had sold his silver Nissan Patrol shortly after the bodies of Clark and Walters had been discovered and identified in the press. He'd seen his car described in the news and quietly gotten rid of it. The case was closing around him, and he didn't fully know it yet. On November 13, 1993, Task Force Air received a call from England. Paul Onions, 24 years old, now back home in the UK, watching news coverage of the Belanglo discoveries. He called and said, "I was there. I got away. I filed a report in Bowral in January 1990. The man introduced himself as Bill. I can describe the car." Detective Gordon at Task Force Air took down the details and went looking for the original Bowral report. It was gone. Not misfiled. Not in an archive. Gone. No record of Paul Onions ever walking into that station existed in any official system. Except one. The constable who had taken his statement 4 years earlier had maintained a detailed personal notebook. She'd written it all down. The description, the registration, the location, the rope, the gun. One notebook. That is the only reason Paul Onions' 1990 report survived. One officer's professional habit of keeping detailed personal notes. Without that notebook, The most important piece of evidence in the entire case had never existed at all. Task Force Air flew Paul Onions back to Australia. On May 5, 1994, he sat in a room and watched a video identification lineup. He pointed at suspect number 4 without hesitation. That's him. That's Bill, Ivan Milat. At 6:36 in the morning on May 22, 1994, Detective Gordon called Ivan Milat's home number from outside the house at Cinnabar Street, Eagle Vale, southwestern Sydney. 50 officers surrounded the property. Armed tactical response officers were positioned at the perimeter. Milat answered. He was told to come out. He hung up. Nothing moved inside the house for several minutes. Then the door opened. On his first day in Maitland Jail, a fellow inmate walked up to Ivan Milat and beat him badly enough to send him to the prison hospital. Even in a population specifically constructed of people who have done terrible things, something about what Ivan Milat had done put a target on him. He recovered. He was transferred. The trial date was set. Detective Clive Small described searching Ivan Milat's home as walking into an Aladdin's cave of evidence. That phrase sounds almost whimsical. It isn't. What it means is this. In every room, in the garage, in the ceiling cavity above the garage, investigators found things that had belonged to people who were dead. In a bedroom wardrobe, 2 sleeping bags. One identified as belonging to Simone Schmidl, who had left Sydney to meet her mother in January 1991. One identified as belonging to Deborah Everest, who had left Melbourne for a music festival and had never been away from home before. Her sleeping bag, in his wardrobe, just hanging there. In his work bag, which he confirmed was his work bag, a 12-inch Bowie knife. In a photo album on a shelf, a photograph of his girlfriend, Challenger Hughes, wearing a striped Benetton top. The top was identical, same pattern, same colors, to one owned by Caroline Clark. In the garage on a shelving rack, a rolled tent in a nylon bag, and wrapped around the tent, a purple headband of the type found at the Simone Schmidl scene. A homemade silencer. The garage ceiling had a manhole access panel. Inside the roof cavity, more weapons, more ammunition. A map of Belanglo State Forest. Inside a leather work boot in the bedroom wardrobe, hidden in the toe of the boot, the bolt and firing pin of a Ruger 1022 semi-automatic rifle. The specific components, once assembled, would be confirmed by ballistic analysis to be from the same weapon used in at least 2 of the Belanglo murders. Elsewhere through the house, electrical cable ties, yellow and blue rope of types consistent with the crime scenes, camping equipment belonging to Simone Schmidl, a .22 caliber Anschutz rifle, Caroline Clark's camera. More ammunition than anyone has a comfortable explanation for. And a box of .45 caliber rounds, the type Paul Onions had described. Small walked through every room of that house and felt something he described carefully afterward. The possessions of dead people were not hidden. They were not locked in a concealed space or buried in a place that required effort to access. They were distributed through the house the way any person's belongings are distributed through their home. Present, casual, expected. The sleeping bags in a wardrobe, the knife in a work bag, the headband wrapped around a tent. He had kept these things the way you keep things that belong in your house. The psychologist, Dr. Holly Schiff, who reviewed the Milat case extensively, noted that keeping the trophies so carelessly concealed was itself diagnostic. It pointed to someone who genuinely didn't believe they'd ever have to hide them, who couldn't fully conceive of a world in which investigators stood in this house with a warrant. 23 years of never being caught had made him genuinely incapable of imagining it. At Campbelltown Police Station, with audio and video recording running, investigators conducted the interview. They showed him a postcard found in the house. Who's this from? A friend in New Zealand. Must have been a mistake. The postcard began. Hi, Bill. Were you known as Bill? No. Must have been a mistake. A bullet found in the bedroom. Did he own firearms? No. The bullet left from when he went shooting with his brother. Every answer was the same shape. Deflect, minimize, attribute elsewhere. The composure of a man who had sat across from accusations before and walked away. The 1971 trial. The acquittal. John Marsden's skill. 23 years of correctness on the other side of these kinds of conversations. But this time John Marsden, when brought in, looked at the evidence and advised Ivan Milat to consider a guilty plea. Milat fired him. He went to trial on all 7 murder charges in April 1996, representing his innocence. On July 27, 1996, after 18 weeks and 145 witnesses, the jury found him guilty on every count. 7 consecutive life sentences. No parole, no possibility of it, ever. He would die in prison. That was the only outcome available to him now. 7 life sentences. And then, nothing. No confession, no cooperation, no deathbed revelation, nothing ever in 23 years of imprisonment that added a single confirmed name to the official count. But the names kept accumulating anyway. 1987. Peter Letcher was 18 years old when he disappeared. His body was found in another New South Wales state forest in 1988. He had been blindfolded. He had been bound. He had been stabbed repeatedly in the back and shot 5 times in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Ballistic testing linked the gun to weapons connected to the Belanglo murders. Clive Small stated publicly, "I am satisfied the 1987 murder of Peter Letcher was Ivan Milat." Nobody was ever charged with Peter Letcher's murder. His case is still open. March 10th, 1991. Carmen Verheyden was 22 years old, hitchhiking on the Hume Highway in Casula, the same stretch, the same area, at 12:30 in the morning. She had just left a party. She wanted to get home to Westmead. She sat outside the Crossroads Hotel waiting for a ride. She has not been seen since. Task Force air detectives looked at her disappearance in November 1993 and concluded they could not find sufficient evidence to connect it to Milat. Insufficient evidence is not the same as not connected. November 23, 1992. Melanie Sutton was 14 years old. Her brother Chad was 16. They left their mother's home in Brisbane on foot, telling her they were going to school. They had privately decided to hitchhike to Perth to find their father. Investigators believe their route took them through the Belanglo State Forest corridor. Neither has ever been found. In 2010, 14 years after Ivan Milat was locked away for the last time, trail bike riders found the skeleton of a young woman in Belanglo State Forest. She was wearing a hot pink t-shirt with the word "Angelic" across the front. She lay unidentified for 5 years. Detectives called her Angel. In 2015, her daughter was found in a suitcase beside a highway in South Australia, over 1,000 kilometers away. The daughter was 2 years old. DNA testing identified the mother as Carly Pierce Stevenson, 20 years old, from Alice Springs. She had been murdered in the Belanglo State Forest in 2008 or 2009, long after Ivan Milat was in prison. Her killer, Daniel Hold'em, had no connection to the Milat family. The forest had produced another body with nothing to do with Ivan Milat. The forest had simply been available. November 20th, 2010. Matthew Milat was 17 years old. He had legally changed his surname from Muliman to Milat in 2007, specifically to claim the association. He had told friends, "You know me, you know my family name, you know what we do." On his friend David Ochterlony's 17th birthday, Matthew lured him to the Belanglo State Forest under the pretense of smoking marijuana and celebrating. His accomplice, Cohen Klein, filmed it on a phone. Matthew Milat killed David Ochterlony in the Belanglo State Forest with a double-sided axe. Afterward, he said to someone, "Do you know what my family is known for? I did what they do." He was sentenced to 43 years in prison, the same forest, a different Milat. The third murder to occur within those trees in 20 years, with at least 2 more unresolved. Ivan Milat was diagnosed with esophageal and stomach cancer in May 2019. He was transferred from Goulburn Supermax, where he had been held in solitary confinement, to Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney on October 11th. Clive Small and other investigators had spent years hoping for exactly this moment. That facing death might unlock something in Milat, that some part of him might want to leave an honest record, that the parents who still didn't know where their children were might get something. He maintained his innocence. He died at 4:07 in the morning on October 27th, 2019. He said nothing. And now I need to come back to the fore, because here's what I left out at the beginning of this video. The part I held back until you understood the full shape of what was happening. In January 1990, when Paul Onions ran from that car and made it to Bowral Police Station, investigators who looked back through the timeline later concluded that at the point of his escape, Ivan Milat had already been operating for at least a year. Deborah Everest and James Gibson had disappeared December 30th, 1989. 26 days before Paul Onions ran. So the filing drawer closing didn't just cost 4 lives. The total cost, from the first confirmed disappearance to the last confirmed murder after Paul Onions' report, is 6. 6 people. 2 before Paul Onions made it out. 4 after the filing drawer closed. 7 total. And then, depending on how far back you trace Peter Letcher, Carmen Verheyden, Melanie and Chad Sutton, the Newcastle women, Lydia Knotts, the others with their names still attached to open cases. The number keeps expanding in a direction that nobody has reached the end of yet. Here is the last archived thing I found while researching this video. In March 2019, the year Milat was dying, investigators made one final attempt. They visited him in Goulburn Supermax and asked him, carefully, about John Marsden's deathbed statement, about the unknown woman Marsden had claimed was present during the Clark and Walters murders. They asked who she was, whether she was still alive, whether, with nothing left to lose, he would give her to them. He stared at them. He said, "I'm innocent." And then he looked away. That woman, if she exists, if Marsden was telling the truth, if she was there in that forest in the specific section called Executioner's Drop, building the pyramid of sticks and ferns above Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, has never been identified. She has never been charged. She may be alive right now, in a house, in a suburb, on a street that looks like every other street, with a knowledge she has carried for more than 30 years. Deborah Everest, 19. James Gibson, 19. Simone Schmidl, 21. Anya Habschied, 20. Gabor Neugebauer, 21. Caroline Clark, 21. Joanne Walters, 22. 7 confirmed, and a forest that is still there, still the same rows of pine trees, still the same pine needle floor that eats sound, still the same fire trail off the Hume Highway, still the same name on that corner of the forest that nobody remembers choosing. Executioner's Drop. There before it had a reason, as if it always knew. If those names stayed with you, if the 4 stayed with you, share this video. Not for the algorithm, for the ones we know, and for the ones we don't. Subscribe if you're new. There are more stories on this channel that deserve to be told the right way. See you in the dark.